and your presentation's already up on the screen. Fantastic. Well, I think at this point then, let me have Dr. Schifrin introduce you. Yeah.
Can you see us?
Thank you.
Can you see us?
I can.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
well, good
absolutely.
morning.
Good morning.
Glad we worked out the technical glitches that we usually seem to have. Thanks for doing this. And why don't you introduce yourself and then give your presentation. This is an audience of some students and some members of the public who have been invited to hear you talk about your topic. So I'll just turn it over to you and let you do it, and I'll assume there'll be time for questions at the end.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon to everyone at the Cary Institute. My name is Cary Anne Cadman, and I'm the Environment Sector Coordinator for the World Bank, covering the Pacific region. There are about 12 countries that are World Bank client countries in the Pacific. And I oversee a portfolio comprised of forestry, fisheries, coastal ecosystem management, and marine pollution. And these are the subsectors that I work in the portfolio. And so today, and of course, climate resilience. And so today, for this discussion, Andy and Rachel and the Institute have invited me to talk to you about certain aspects of climate change, particularly climate resilience in the Pacific, and what the World Bank is doing to address a lot of these challenges, which are fairly significant. I'm sure you know. Is the audio transmitting all right? Let me just ask that.
Yes. Yes, I think that we can hear you quite well. Can you hear us?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, good.
Great.
Excellent. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. I've been at the World Bank for 21 years now, and Andy has been kind enough to invite me every year to offer a different lecture at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And so it's been such a pleasure working with Andy over all of these years, and he's seen me sort of traverse the world in all the countries that I worked in, and now just getting this nice exposure to the Pacific. So I really wish I could have been there, but this photo right here, this is a photo of Kiribati that I took when I was coming in a couple weeks ago, and you can see physically how isolated and how fragile it actually is, right? And this was part of the reason why I'm not there with you today is there was a very big storm and the Fiji airline couldn't land to pick us up and bring me to you. So thank goodness for the technology. And I'm glad that it's worth for me to be here with you today. So Rachel, should I go straight into my presentation, or did you want to?
Yeah, I think at this point, just go straight in. We'll make sure that you can slip through your PowerPoints just fine with no technical difficulties.
Okay, perfect. I'll time myself because I know we have about an hour, so I want to make sure there's time for discussion. So when we think about climate change, when we think about the Pacific context itself, last year, 2018, was a pretty tremendous year for what science is showing us, basically, in the sense of, the IPCC report coming out, the U.S. climate assessment, the UN Global Environmental Outlook, and of course the report from the Stockholm Resilience Center, all talked about these tipping points that we're really up against in the very near term, right? It's no longer 50, 100, 200 years from now. It's very much right now, right, in our life. And we learned a lot about what's important in the climate change discussion and what's going to be happening, right? One of the sort of main findings that we learned was that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is quite significant, right? We learned that the impacts of the 1.5 warming are far worse than we thought. That we only have really 11 years, and for many of us, you know how quickly 11 years evaporates, and this is all we have to keep the temperatures from rising above 1.5. The difference between 1.5 and 2, as I said, is huge, But it'll mean significantly worse storms and droughts and floods and extreme heat and impacts on people all around the world. We've seen this recently, not only in the Midwest of America, but in the Zambezi countries, in Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Malawi, for example, just quite recently. In the Pacific, it's an everyday occurrence, right? If a country is not experiencing a natural disaster, a severe natural disaster, it's recovering from the last one, and I'll go into some of those details a little bit later. We know now with the science that came out last year that floods would be 170% worse at 2 degrees than 1.5 degrees. Grain production would be up to 20% lower. Corals will be 100% extinct, right? And when you you're seeing this. We're seeing this now. I worked in the Coral Triangle for years when I was based in Indonesia. Widespread, death across the board in terms of the coral reefs in some of these wonderful nations that have the largest coral reefs in the world. They're going, right? The oceans are going, and these ecosystems are disappearing. You see it in some of the remotest places in the world, particularly here in the Pacific. And these types of changes are going to affect everyone, right? And to stay below to stay below 1.5, we need to make unprecedented changes now, right? And this is going to be extremely difficult, and I think given where we are in different countries, key countries in particular, it's going to be extremely difficult to do that. So in terms of setting the overall stage, what we look at is saying, well, what do you do, right? What are some of the solutions that you could, let me make sure I can move my slides here. Hold on a second. There. So this slide right here just gives you that summary, a nice synthesis of the scientific literature that came out recently, and what we're looking at in the next decade, right? And the economic costs of these natural disasters. In 2017, natural disasters cost globally $320 billion US, and in 2018 it was $225 billion. And of course, the loss of life and the cost to infrastructure is quite enormous. So in this slide here, you can see the path that we're going on. It's completely unsustainable, right? And so life on Earth will be extremely different in the next generation. It's also a sense of, it's not just the climate, it's the natural resource degradation, it's the degradation of the baseline. And I'm sure many of you are very well versed, well read in these areas, but when you put these two together, the increasing impacts and significance of the impacts of climate change are exacerbated further by the environmental degradation that's happening alongside. So what did we find? We found that in terms of top global risks going forward, this is the World Economic Forum found that extreme weather, climate policy failure, natural disaster, extreme water shortages, accelerated biodiversity loss, environmental disasters, and then large-scale involuntary migration. And this last one is a point that is very significant for the Pacific. And what you can see here, this is if you look up here to the top right, you can see the airstrip for Tarawa. This is where I was trying to get to you last week. And this is the sort of situation that you're looking at. But you can see here in this photo where the ocean is and then where the lagoon is, and it's really just one road, right? So a king tide, a storm will completely wipe out downtown. And these are very low-lying atolls. So a country like Kiribati, in the next 50 years, will disappear. It'll disappear in the sense that the fresh water lands will be exhausted, and it will no longer be a habitable country. And so when we think about the Pacific, these are the world's most vulnerable countries to ongoing natural disasters and climate change. 3 of the countries will become uninhabitable in the next 50 years. This is Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Kiribati. And what do you do? And so the type of involuntary migration is completely climate change related, and a lot of these islanders are then migrating either to Fiji, Australia, New Zealand, or up to Canada. And they're never going back, right? And so their national identity, their territory, there's the implications of this involuntary migration, because you know it's permanent. How do you retain that identity? How do you retain the sovereignty over your ocean space? Because these countries are called small island developing states, but really they're large ocean states, right? The exclusive economic zone of Kiribati, for example, is 700 times the size of its actual physical territory. So really the ocean space and the resources in those oceans are what provide the bulk of the revenue and GDP, contribute to the GDP of these countries. So when we think about the Pacific itself, we know that this region will actually bear the brunt of inaction on climate change globally. And these countries, particularly led by Fiji, have been the most vocal in global fora on climate change. They were very vocal in Paris, at the Paris COP. This photograph right here shows you all of downtown Tarawa, and this is the most densely populated part of Kiribati, right? So this is just a shot of downtown. So you can imagine this is the country, right? There's one road, and for me it was a very it was a very surprising shock to go to countries that physically have one road, right? You either go south or you go north, and you have an ocean house or a lagoon house, right? These are the extreme conditions under which these countries exist. So when we think about how climate change is going to impact on sea level rise, the exhaustion of the freshwater lens, the fragility. Think about. There's no agriculture here, right? There's no farming here. There's no livestock here. The Ikiribati depend completely on their inshore fisheries and on some of the pelagics for their protein, right? And when you have pollution, there's quite a lot of pollution. And when this is further exacerbated by, let's say there's a natural disaster, most, if not all, of the construction in the Pacific is with asbestos, right? Even today, even though we know the implications of that. So when a storm comes through, it blows open all of the asbestos. And that's sort of, just in the environment itself, there's no cleanup, right? And what we have found in the Marshall Islands, for example, there have been studies of the level of toxicity in the fish that are being consumed domestically, and they found that in Kwajalein, one of the island groupings in Marshall Islands, all of the coastal fish are carcinogenic. And this has to do with heavy metals, it has to do with ship waste, it has to do with the military base, but it has to do with untreated pollution, right? It also has to do with the nuclear legacy. So when you look at the constellation of challenges that these countries face, it's the nuclear legacy, it's the World War II sunken ships that are now leaking the oil, it's the disasters blowing open the asbestos from the construction, and all of this comes together to eliminate their food source. It exhausts their fresh water supply, and it eliminates a lot of their infrastructure. Last February, Cyclone Gita in Tonga is the worst cyclone in 60 years in Tonga, and it basically flattened the domestic airport and parliament, among other, many other buildings. But when your airport is destroyed and parliament's destroyed, countries can't function, and this happens on a fairly frequent basis. The data that we have show that since 1950, the natural disasters in the Pacific have adversely impacted about 9 million people and resulted in about 5 billion in damages. And so when you think about the substantial economic impacts of this, it also impacts the food supply. So in Samoa and Tonga, for example, they're hit quite frequently with cyclones. Cyclone Gita wiped out all of Tonga's fruit supply. And so when you don't have fruit, when you don't have fish, when you don't have water, how do you survive, right? And so what I like about the slide, it's a simple slide, but what I like about it, it shows that the climate impacts are not operating in an isolated arena in the Pacific. They're really compounding a lot of the poverty issues, a lot of the development constraints that these countries face. and the very high exposure to these natural disasters is just making it worse, right? And so you have to deal with this constellation of constraints to be able to ensure that the citizens of these countries can survive, that they can thrive, that they can get out of poverty. And this is, of course, the goal of the World Bank, is to reduce global poverty and ensure shared prosperity for populations across the globe. I'd like to highlight this slide here because it speaks to, when we look at these numbers, when we look at the data and we think about the reality of the situation, people will turn to the World Bank and say, well, what are you doing? And why can't we do more? But when you think of any country in the Pacific, for example, or any fragile state in the world, there are a lot of actors out there. There are a lot of stakeholders like the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the EU, New Zealand, Japan, Australia, USA, France. And so you have a lot of different climate investment funds, you have a lot of regional bodies, you have a lot of funding agencies and stakeholders. But you can imagine some of these countries have a ministry, a line ministry, maybe with 30 people, right? These are 30 individuals running the entire environment portfolio of a country. And if one of these 30 people gets sick, if another one's on training, if another one's on leave, all of a sudden you have a skeletal staff of 12 people that are running a portfolio with 25 different inputs. And so the absorptive capacity of these countries is very fragile. And their ability to respond and absorb the funds and actually implement the programs that are trying to ameliorate the conditions is actually quite difficult. So you have to balance that as well. So under these types of conditions, what is the World Bank doing globally? What are we doing on a larger scale? How do we work with our partners? And what are some of the changes that we're looking to put in place in a sub-region like the Pacific? So in this slide, and I'll share all of this with you so you can have a copy of it. But here we have 5 institutions. There are 5 institutions that comprise the World Bank Group. The first 2, IBRD and IDIS, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the International Development Association. These are the 2 public sector arms of the World Bank. And there's been a renewed commitment in terms of the key sectors that we're supporting on mitigation, which is not quite relevant to the Pacific. It's much more adaptation here. We're working on carbon pricing. We're working on disclosing greenhouse gas emissions in all of our operations. But you'll see at the top, our target is we've set aside for the next 5 years $200 billion in financing. So all of the projects of the World Bank are now couched from a climate perspective. And so when I design projects with my clients, what I have to do is I have to do a climate screening, greenhouse gas accounting, and I have to put in place measures to increase resilience and the adaptation elements of any project that I do. And so across the board, we're looking at least 35% of our portfolio, if not more, it's about 50 in the Pacific, has a very clear climate dimension. And this additional funding here will help make those changes. And what we're doing is we're supporting countries to implement their NDCs, right? These are the declarations, the contributions that they tabled at the Paris COP. So, and we're also not, if you go to the upper right of this slide, at the One Planet Summit, is just, I think it was, last month, we talked about not investing in oil and gas and extractives anymore in oil and gas. We're looking, for example, in Indonesia, where we have an $11 billion portfolio. 4 billion of that portfolio is in energy, and we are funding all of the renewable energy and energy efficiency investments in Indonesia to get them away from coal. And so all of the hydro and the aeolic energy and the solar, this is what the World Bank resources are going into. We want to give Indonesia an option away from coal because they're a very large coal producer like Australia. And so the commitments that we've put here, you'll have a copy of these slides after the lecture today, really shows how the World Bank is structuring our broader global program and then our regional commitments. We have also, in addition to our stock funding, this is for our lending and for our grants in least developed countries or fragile states, we have different facilities, right? So there are different windows of funding that are available in the World Bank. One of them is the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and this is where we help countries build resilience and recover from catastrophic climate events. We deal with data and open sourcing a lot of the data that are needed to make very quick decisions, but also very important post-disaster recovery decisions. We provide early warning systems to more than 100 million people, and across the small island developing states, and particularly in the Pacific, we have a very large framework program where we're providing early warning systems across the board. Because as you can imagine, you saw some of these photographs. Where do you shelter, and how do you prepare for these disasters is very important, right, for surviving and to ensure that some of the infrastructure, when you rebuild it, can be built in a resilient format. And so the GFDRR provides additional funding for that. So when we're assessing and managing risk, we're looking at cyclone patterns, we're looking at the severity, the frequency, and we blend that and match that with our resources in our resilience portfolio. So in the Pacific, our program is basically structured in 5 pillars that we can go into detail during the discussion. The first one is investments in actual physical resilience and risk reduction. So providing access to the data that will allow decision makers, policymakers, to make the right decisions about minimizing risk when a disaster will strike. Physical resilience, we're looking at green infrastructure like mangroves, but we're also looking at the physical resilience of the shoreline and the physical infrastructure that a country has. How do you build more resilient infrastructure so that when a cyclone comes, when an earthquake hits, that infrastructure will survive? So we have a portfolio of about $430 million in the Pacific that's looking at public facilities such as schools and hospitals, ICT infrastructure, aviation, maritime, as well as fishery and agriculture. And this has to do with, of course, food security, water security, right? And I can give you some examples when we get to the discussion. We also have another pillar, which is our post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. And this is about $210 million that we have just in helping countries recover. So the major disasters like Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu and Gita in Tonga, we really help these countries. We're one of the first responders that come in immediately to assess the situation. Actually, when the tsunami happened most recently in Sulawesi in Indonesia, our team of post-disaster specialists were actually in Indonesia helping with the recovery of that post-tsunami disaster. The third pillar is policy reform. We really try to align a lot of the policies to ensure that we have the resilience and disaster risk management tools in place in country. We've developed an innovative tool called a catastrophe deferred drawdown option, or a CAT-DDO. And this affords countries immediate liquidity in the form of direct budget support after a natural disaster. It's immediately, within 24 hours, they'll get an injection of funding available to purchase the food and water and emergency supplies, medical supplies that they need. And so when we look at packaging different financial solutions and actually interventions at the country level, particularly in the Pacific, a lot of it is driven by this resilience and post-disaster management and risk. So when we think about risk financing and insurance instruments, this is our fourth pillar, we think about how do we give large payouts very quickly, because they don't just need supplies coming in. I mean, you've seen many instances of post-disaster supplies are flown in. They actually just need cash, right? They need cash to buy water and food very, very quickly, and the medical supplies. And so here, for example, this is our Pacific Catastrophe Risk Assessment and Financing Initiative, and it's a package of 5 different interventions that allow the countries to access the insurance payouts, to do some disaster risk financing, and urban planning and design very quickly for that recovery so that the country can get up and running again. I think this just gives you a little bit of a flavor of what we do. When we think about the Pacific Island countries and their nationally determined contributions, there's some mitigation priorities, energy efficiency, renewable energy, sea transport and shipping, particularly in the Marshall Islands. Majuro is the largest port in the Pacific. It's very significant for transshipment, but it's also very significant for the shipping lines. And so how do you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from those ships? How do you ensure that the waste management is being taken care of properly? And then air transport. Air transport is fairly significant. We build all of the airports in the Pacific. We build them to resilience standards so that they can actually be emergency shelters for the population should a cyclone hit. So they're built up to withstand very high level and intense cyclones, because you do need that type of infrastructure available. We have in Tuvalu, for example, the runway, the sea level rise was actually infiltrating the runway. And so we had to figure out a way to make a new runway that would withstand the sea level rise. Right? You can imagine these types of constraints. You have to come up with some pretty unique solutions. But adaptation is really at the heart of what's happening here in the Pacific. And I can go into some examples when we have our discussion. Let me just touch on two. Since I just came from Kiribati, and you can see here in the lower right what the Tarawa Atoll looks like. It really, when I'm flying over these countries, all of a sudden, you have hours and hours of ocean, and then you see a little stream. And this is what these coral atolls are like. They're just this little thin string, and they surround a lagoon. And so what do you do, right? With these countries quite vulnerable, how do you assess the risk? How do you respond to it? And so in our Kiribati adaptation program, we're looking at a couple of things. We're working with communities to install rainwater harvesting tanks. Why does this make a difference? Because when a disaster hits, their access to groundwater is quite limited, and they need water immediately to help them have potable water accessible, right? We're planting mangroves to provide that green infrastructure. Mangroves can increase the coastal resilience and buffer from storm surges. And it's of course a natural way of resolving storm surge impacts in these types of coastal communities. We're looking at how do we put horizontal wells in some of these communities, right? How do we provide the types of clean water supply that they need, and then using drones to do the survey work. So drone technology, a lot of the disruptive technology that is available to us today in the Pacific, given how geographically isolated these countries are, how difficult it is to get to a lot of these outer islands, that new technology, the new open data sources that are available, the new analytical tools that we have are really helping us come up with some very creative solutions to island groupings that are very, very isolated and don't have, for example, in Tonga, to go to the Niue island grouping, there's one flight a month, right? And maybe the plane will show up. And so you could be stuck for 2 months there. How do you get food and water and medical supplies to these countries? Another example is, of course, our Marshall Island Resilience Program. This is where we're actually going beyond the green resilience. We're actually building a seawall in Ebay is really a coastal island. It's a slum, and the population density is very high. Sewage concerns are aggravating situations. So we're putting in a seawall. We're doing a lot of the cleanup there. And so how do you strengthen the capacity of the Natural Disaster Management Office? How do you help these communities assess risk and respond to it? And so one of the solutions here was putting in place hazard warning systems to communities and help involve them in the planning and evaluation of early warning and shoreline protection. So these are just some examples of the type of projects that we have in the Pacific. I want to stop here because we're at the 30-minute mark now, and open up for questions or discussion. I can go into a little bit more detail on any of these aspects, but I hope this gives you a sense of the broad brush global scenario, or actually reality that we're all living in. And then when you come to the Pacific the fragility and the vulnerability of these countries and what they're really struggling with, not just with climate change, but natural resource degradation, their food and their water source. This right here is downtown Majuro in the Marshall Islands, right? And that's it. That's the country. And so you can think about one storm surge, you can think about one cyclone, what it does, how devastating it is to these countries. So let me stop here and see if there are any questions that you may have or any points that you would like me to go a little bit more into detail. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I do have a couple questions, actually.
Sure.
First is, you spoke a lot about freshwater collection
Yes.
for these islands.
Yes.
And I imagine that issues like acid rain aren't a problem now, but as the climate begins to change, do we predict that they could become an issue? Especially if these countries, if their only source of fresh water is from rainwater collection. And then twofold, is the World Bank focused on relocation at all, or is it all about building resilience? Because
Good question.
30 years from now, Bangladesh is predicted to lose 20% of its land, and that's displacing like 9 million people or something. So what is the World Bank doing, or what are you doing to focus on that?
No, these are excellent questions. What's your name?
Sorry, my name is Cameron Stegall. I'm an international environmental policy student here at MIIS.
Oh, very nice to meet you, Cameron. Okay, no, I'd like to know who I'm talking to. So thank you, Cameron. Should I get a couple of other questions, or would you like me to respond one-on-one?
Let's go one-on-one.
Okay, great. Okay, so Cameron, thank you for these great questions. Look, acid rain right now is not the biggest issue on the table for the Pacific. Will it be in the future? The future for the Pacific is quite bleak, as you can imagine, right? I don't know how many people will be living there if and when acid rain may become a problem. I don't think it's going to become a problem in the next 50 years. For these countries, but it is significant elsewhere, of course, right? What these countries are dealing with, and let me just segue into this broader pollution problem. I did a lot of work on marine pollution in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, because in East Asia, the top 4 plastics polluters are in East Asia. That's another discussion that we can have later. But what I found was really shocking when I came to the Pacific was the nuclear legacy that I mentioned before, and the World War II shipwrecks, right? These are far more impactful to the Pacific in terms of the health of their water, the status of their water, but also the fisheries, the fish that they eat. And so right now, you can imagine from the time there's been a lot of nuclear testing out here. And what they've done is they've covered in concrete a lot of the nuclear waste, but now it's seeping out because that concrete is degrading. And so you find in Palau, for example, and Chuk, it's actually Chuk in Micronesia, that if you go diving or snorkeling, you won't see any fish, right? Because of all the nuclear seepage that's coming out now. And so it's another generation that is suffering from the nuclear disaster that has been placed in the Pacific from all of that testing. So I would say that that's far more of an issue right now in terms of water security, water safety, and food security. In terms of the relocation, I'm so glad you brought that up, Cameron. The World Bank, we are not in a position to relocate citizens of sovereign nations elsewhere. These would be other UN bodies. The World Bank is a development institution that's focused on development interventions to boost sustainable economic prosperity, reduce poverty. But we have not gotten into, so we don't work with refugees, we don't deal with relocation per se, but I'm glad you brought it up because the migration, the scale of involuntary migration that will be happening going forward, and what will be happening and is happening now in the Pacific will only accelerate and become more significant. What's interesting about your question is that how do these Pacific Islanders, these citizens of these countries, they don't want to move, right? This is their country, this is their identity, this is their history, this is their home. They're angry, right? They're angry that these changes that are completely out of their control are being imposed on them, and they're bearing the brunt of the world's decisions, or the decisions of many countries in the world, and they're quite angry that they have to move and they have to leave their homes permanently, and they have to be guests in another nation forever, right? And so for the World Bank, it would not be appropriate for us to come in physically help them relocate, because we have to deal with identity issues, we have to deal with social inclusion issues, and we are not well equipped as an institution to get into the business of relocation. What we do is build resilience and try to provide for a high quality of life, food security, stability, water security, and physical security from natural disasters for the time period that they're there. But there's already this flow out, and we've seen it, for example, in Tuvalu. It's a country of 11,000 citizens. Today, 5,000 of those citizens live in Auckland, New Zealand, right? And if you go to Auckland, you'll see that it is actually the most diverse Pacific Island nation in the world. The city itself has more diversity of Pacific Islanders than all of the Pacific Islands. Because New Zealand is, as you know, has some fantastic policies. They're quite open and welcoming, but they're also bearing, this in-migration, and how do they balance that? How do you stave off conflicts? Fiji is another country that is taking in, because they have the physical space, taking in quite a number of these migrations. But again, this leads to conditions of conflict. And how do countries like New Zealand, like Fiji, how do they equip themselves and prepare themselves to diffuse any future conflict as the migration increases? So these are a little bit long-winded answers, but I really love your questions, and these are really very much at the forefront of what we're thinking about. Some of them we can deal with, the others the World Bank is not the right institution to deal with those.
Can I ask one more follow-up to that? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, everybody. So do you personally think that this is the best use of the World Bank resources? If islands like Tuvalu and Kiribati are likely going to disappear in the next 30 years, when we could spend all this money on helping Auckland develop and be better prepared for an influx of 10,000 people?
Yeah. Look, that's a great question, and the trade-offs that we look at is, okay, do you do your best right now for the next 50 years while these island nations are habitable to put in place systems so that the citizens of these countries can live in their territory, right, and they can live a decent life. Is that sufficiently valid to invest these public resources now? Will there be solutions in 10, 15, 20 years that we don't know of today that will enable them to stay there, right? And for forever, right? We don't know. We don't know what the technology of the future will provide in terms of tools to improve, ameliorate the situation for Pacific Islanders, particularly in these three low-lying atolls. One of the things that Andy and I have spoken about is how do you invest in providing the resources for the citizens to live there now? How do you put in place legal structures? And there are a few early thinkers on this. How do you put in place legal structures to enable the citizens of countries, once they've been displaced, to retain sovereignty over their territory, over their exclusive economic zone, their fisheries, their oceanic fisheries? As you know, Pacific tuna is it's $3 billion industry annually for these Pacific Islands out of the world's $5 billion tuna industry. So Pacific tuna is huge, right? And it can represent upwards to 60–80% of their GDP. So it is their income source, right? It is what runs their economy. And then once these, you can imagine the citizens leaving, the Tuvaluans, how do they retain exclusive control of the fisheries resources, of the deep sea mineral resources to provide the ongoing revenue for the citizens that have been displaced? So a lot of the work that many, not the World Bank, but the development actors are looking at, they're looking at what do we do now, right, to provide them with a good quality of life? What do we do to prepare them for the future? So different institutions have different roles to play. Do I think it's a good use of public resources? Absolutely. I've seen the difference that it makes in the day-to-day lives of many Pacific Islanders, and how they're living out their lives in their country is of paramount importance. And so you can't, at least from my perspective, to just go in and say, okay, your country's gone, move now. That's not a viable solution, right? We don't have the tools in place for that. It's also not what they want, right? And respecting that and providing them with a quality of life that allows them to live in their country, I think that's quite valid. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you so much.
Very, very.
You're welcome.
Another question? I saw a hand back there. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. My name's David, and if I can
Hi, David.
formulate my question, do you think that you're more tending to stabilize what we have and then incrementally go on from there, or you are wrapped up in anticipating the future and trying to get there first ahead of utter disaster?
Look, that's a good question. I would say we do a little bit of both. I think we focus a lot on stabilization in the immediate post-disaster period. But the World Bank it's a long-term player, right? It's a long-term development partner. So what we're trying to do is put in place very resilient infrastructure, very good water, reliable water systems, sustainable fisheries. So the programs that I do are looking at how do you ensure the health of the fish that are being consumed domestically, how do you ensure the health of the fish that are being exported, because you don't want the exports to be banned, for example, right, if they have very high toxins. And so I would say that the World Bank tends to look at more of the incremental part of the equation and preparing for the future. And this is where what are the technologies available now to provide us with all of the data that can help us make informed decisions across sectors, from maritime transport to shipping to fisheries to agriculture, water, sewage, sanitation, solid waste, health, education, right? So the food supply, I'm sure you can imagine, there's been a huge shift in the food consumption patterns of Pacific Islanders, and they have some of the highest incidence of obesity. And the health concerns of these populations, their life expectancy is quite low, just based on the food basket that they're consuming at this point. It's all of the imported packaged goods. And so the nutrition aspect, the health aspects, the medical provisions that are available. This is where the World Bank does a very good job in providing that type of support. Stabilization, this is really, it's part and parcel of it, but the UN has quite a lot of bodies and other, for example, Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific, they're really the largest players. They come in, the Navy, the Australian Navy plays a very significant role, as does New Zealand, in terms of that immediate post-disaster recovery and stabilization. So I thank you, David, for that question. I hope I answered it.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Abby. I'm a student here in MIIS, IPO 0.
Hi.
And part of my question is a bit personal for me.
Okay.
Since Palau is really, really close to the southern Philippines, which is where I'm from, I'm wondering whether that the nuclear waste, the leaking of the nuclear waste might become a potential transboundary issue. And how are you dealing with it?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think we know so little of the transboundary implications of this type of waste. We saw with Japan, right? With that, if you can just Google online what happened after Japan's disaster and all of the nuclear seepage into the Pacific Ocean, it's already reached California, right? It's on your shoreline. So if you look across the Pacific, everything that happened in Japan is already washing up on your shore. So what are the long-term impacts? What are the impacts on fisheries, on marine mammals, on you, right? On your food supply, your water supply? I don't think we have those data yet to the extent to make decisions, and so it'll be a longer process of collecting the information and systematically building up the data to show us what's really happening, right? We, the World Bank, when we think about exclusive economic zones and we think about areas beyond national jurisdiction, this is where the law of the sea applies, right? And so UNCLOS, which is the United Nations law of the sea, looks at areas beyond national jurisdiction. It looks at what happens with these transboundary pollution issues. And there's a convention called MARPOL. It's the Marine Pollution Convention. So UNCLOS and MARPOL really deal with these types of issues. So it's much more of a UN body. Where the World Bank has been consulted is on deep sea minerals and ultra deep sea minerals, in looking at should countries permit deep seabed mining in their territorial sea, in their exclusive economic zone, and what are the environmental implications of this? So you don't have today the exploratory, the actual equipment to go down and extract these resources, but you can't do an environmental impact assessment, right, or a strategic environmental assessment on something that has never been done before. And we're in a sense, we're walking blind in knowing what are the environmental implications, what are the transboundary implications of deep seabed mining. So I think, Abby, your question is very relevant. We know that this is happening in Palau. We know it's happening in Marshall Islands and elsewhere. Is it seeping out and impacting the Philippines? Probably, right? Do we have those data? We don't. And so I think, Abby, in the work that you're doing, if you're inspired by this, there's a whole world out there for you, and I would hope that you would be one of the movers and leaders in this, in figuring out ways to get those data, analyze them, and tell that story and bring it to the forefront, table some solutions if there are any, but at least as an awareness and warning as to this is quite serious. And I think you've seen that, Abby, and others with the plastics revolution globally. It was a very quiet issue for a long time, but really in the last 5 years, it's really exploded. And the amount of action and traction on reducing plastics, eliminating plastics, looking for different types of materials that could replace plastics, the utility of plastics. I've never seen that level of momentum, earlier than 5 years ago. So perhaps this could be something that would be tabled, but that's really more of a UN body issue. The World Bank doesn't have the staff or the tools to engage in that area, and it's an area that, because our lending and our tools are country specific, client specific, we wouldn't be able to go into that area beyond national jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
I have a question. My name is James.
Yes. Hi, James.
Maybe you could talk about the cultural and political challenges, power struggles and communication issues and so forth. I'd just like you to generally talk about those challenges.
Well, I have, I gave it to Andy, and I'll share it again. I can send it to you. There's a wonderful film. It's a short film that was made in the Marshall Islands about the impacts of climate change. It touched on the Bikini Atoll, nuclear testing, and it's a short documentary of the children, the Marshallese children, being interviewed about their future and about having to leave the Majuro Atoll. They're Bikini Islanders, but they've never been to the Bikini Atoll, and now these are 12, 14-year-olds saying, I come from the Bikini Island, but I can't go there, and now I'm being pushed off of the Majuro Atoll, and I'm a guest here, and I'm going to be a guest somewhere else now in a third place. And it's just their loss of identity, their loss of nation. Pacific Islanders are very intimately woven into their immediate environment. The Kiribati, for example, they're phenomenal seafarers, right? The stories that I've heard where they can get into just a very simple canoe, and they can go for weeks, and if they get lost at sea, they can survive for months and eventually come back. And it's just a very normal part of their existence. And the way they explain it is, well, I can see the current going in this direction, or there's a movement in the water, and I know that soon I'll reach land, or I know that soon I'll be able to get these types of resources, or that a storm is coming. So they can read their environment in a way that non-seafarers can't, right? And so that to me showcases the intimate connection or that the Pacific Islanders have with the ocean and their physical reality. That is, it's very similar to what I saw with indigenous communities in the Brazilian Amazon when I would work in the Amazon, where there's just that intimate connection of human and environment. We've all heard about it, right? Many of you have probably experienced it to a certain extent. But so on the cultural side, that intimate connection is being torn apart, right? And it's devastating. It's devastating for them. It's devastating to watch it. For them to experience it, it's sort of ripping apart part of their soul, right? The political situation, look, one of the things that really amazes me about working in the Pacific is the incredible diversity. You have kingdoms, right? So there's the kingdom of Tonga, and I love working in Tonga. I work in fisheries there. It's open resource, coastal, so they don't have sort of, what we're putting in place now is these sort of special management areas, but they have what they call the royal box, right? And the royal box is basically the area within the territorial sea that belongs to the king. And this is where the king can fish, and it's fantastic when you start looking at the different political structures, the dynamics that are going on. Each country is quite unique in their priorities. So I don't know, James, in terms of which aspect of political structure you are interested in. Could you maybe refine your question a little bit so I can give you a coherent answer?
Sure. I know the Philippines political situation is challenging, and that's the only one that I'm really aware of that has a particular challenge to it. And it's hard to navigate in certain situations, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Even from the World Bank perspective, you mean, or from So look, we're an organization, we're a global organization, and our client countries, the way that we operate is our main interlocutor or liaison is, of course, the Ministry of Finance. And the way these countries operate with the World Bank, they actually own us, right? So my boss ultimately is the president of President Hein of the Marshall Islands. It's the Minister of Finance in Tonga. So the executive directors of the World Bank, they oversee all of our operations, all of our projects that they review and approve. So when we're working with our clients, we're saying, okay, you're a member of the World Bank, you have access to this sort of financial pot of money. So let me give you the example of the IDA. So the IDA cycle is every 3 years. And for example, Fiji will get, a 45 million, Tonga will get 66 million US dollars. And in that 3-year period, the Ministry of Finance with the line ministries, they will allocate those resources and say, okay, I want sewage, I want education, health, and fisheries. These are the 4 programs I want for that $66 million over the next 6 years, but I have a 3-year window to allocate those resources. Their executive director, along with all of the other executive directors representing the 180 members of the World Bank group, will review and approve whatever project we bring for Tonga or for Fiji to the board. So in terms of how we engage with different political structures, they really are our bosses, and we work with them to design the best sector interventions, the best policy support projects that we can, given the knowledge that we have. And for example, in Indonesia, when it's a very large coal producer, but we said, well, energy is important for you. Why don't we use your allocation, their IBRD, your IBRD lending potential? Why don't we focus on renewable energy? Why don't we focus on green energy rather than more coal? And so when we present these types of options, it either it resonates or it doesn't resonate right now, and we work with them. So we try to introduce solutions that provide for sustainability, poverty reduction, and shared prosperity. We really want every citizen to gain access to opportunity and the types of benefits that our projects generate. So in terms of pushing an agenda or suggesting, making suggestions, we want all of our projects to be environmentally sound, all of them to have a climate dimension. In the Pacific, we have 5 corporate requirements. There's a gender dimension that's quite strong. There's citizen engagement. There is nutrition, of course. Maximizing finance for development. We want to leverage private sector resources responsibly. And so what all of our projects, it's not just a bank grant or a bank loan. Our projects are developed with very much looking at sustainability and social inclusion. So I hope that gives you a sense of how we interact with different political structures around the world.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question for you, Ms. Cadman. So I understand that the UN body is currently, or there's a global body currently renegotiating or negotiating a high seas agreement. And it's got a wonderful acronym I cannot remember, but do any of the IEP students know a bit about this high seas agreement that's kind of going through the negotiation process right now?
Is it PB&J?
It's BB&J. I think, does that,
Yeah.
so you know about that. So
Yeah.
let's say that gets approved, and the global body says, okay, high seas, we're going to put more emphasis on protection of the high seas. We're going to try to let fish stocks replenish in the high seas. We're going to try to curb trafficking of not only illegal unreported fishing, but humans and arms and all of the things that happen in the high seas. How will that? How does that link in? How will that really affect the EEZs of all of these, especially their ocean-generated economies, ocean-generated livelihoods? I just wanted to hear your perspective on that agreement.
Look, Rachel, it's fantastic, right? We want this. I'll give you a very clear example. So this is what I was mentioning about the areas beyond national jurisdiction. This is exactly the work that's being done with the UN. This is actually looking at how do you eliminate all of the illegality, the illegal activities that are happening in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. And this is very impactful for the Pacific, because what you'll have is to come into, for example, the exclusive economic zone of Marshall Islands or Kiribati. You have to abide by certain rules. You have to purchase your vessel day schemes if you're going to come fishing or traverse EEZs. But when you go into these areas of beyond national jurisdiction, anything can happen, right? And so what can happen is they have these. There are 2 types of fishing vessels for tuna: purse seiners or longliners. And the longliners, as you can imagine, are just a vessel with a very, very long line that goes on for kilometers. And those vessels can sit in the areas beyond national jurisdiction while their line goes into the EEZ, right? And so you can't do anything because they're outside of the EEZ, even though their line is there, but you can't catch them, right? And so by putting in place more stringent rules, regulations, and agreements for these areas, it will permit these countries to decrease the illegal activity and the loss of revenue, and control much more and manage the stock, the health of the different tuna species, the 4 different tuna species. So I think in that sense, it'll be good for the living natural resources, right? It'll also be very good for what Abby had mentioned about the transboundary pollution. So when we think about ships, right? I went to a conference a few years ago where it really struck me when the shipping industry was saying, you know, in the next decade or so, the presence of ships on the world's oceans will become permanent. It will not just be a transient movement in time. It will be a permanent traffic jam of vessels around the world, and the shipping lines will just become permanent. And so when you think about waste, when you think about the type of waste materials or materials that they're transporting around the world, these areas beyond national jurisdiction, you're not able to really deal with the pollution implications of this, right? And so by providing a stronger agreement around the high seas, those types of issues will be able to be readily addressed. So I very much welcome that.
I have a couple of points. One really for you, Rachel. Cary Anne, you said you would send the your slides and that video.
Yes, of course.
Is there some way, Rachel, you can put that up online where people who are not part of MIIS can get it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's it's just go to MIIS, type in sustainability. It should bring up the sustainability speaker series, of which Ms. Cadman was so graciously a part of. And I will put the slides there, eventually the video there, and any link to this film that would give us some context. You were talking about the young people of the Bikini Atoll. That would be great.
So you'll send those, Cary Anne, to Rachel?
I'll do that today.
Great.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question about the coordination aspects of all these, that slide that showed all those groups out, all those agencies out there with various programs, and the kind of limited resources that some of these small countries have. Is there a program that provides them kind of the technical assistance where they can have their own staff that is reaching out to these various agencies, identifying potential funding sources, and sort of coordinating some kind of overall? I mean, in this country, we talk about recovery plans and identifying various sources of funding for various kinds of long-term recovery improvements. Is there some kind of, you have all these agencies that provide very specific kinds of services or even general services, but do the countries have the ability to really, or the technical ability to access them or plan for them?
Yeah, look, Andy, that's a great question. So if you look at the blue boxes on this slide, SPREP, SPC, and PIFs, these are what are called the regional agencies. In the Pacific, because each country is dealing and juggling with so many players and funds and actors, development partners, in addition to their own, strategies and investment programs, right, out of their own budget. It was Australia, New Zealand, in partnership with the countries. They said, look, so many of the challenges that we face on environment, climate change, fisheries, really, maritime connectivity is shared across the region, right? Even though they're quite different in each of these island countries, there is a shared sense of certain challenges or certain agendas. And so the crop agencies were created to help share lessons, but also to help in that coordination. And so a lot of the capacity strengthening, a lot of the analytical work, the technical assistance work that a country A, B, or C would need, they'll go, for example, to SPC is the South Pacific Community, and what SPC does is they work with coastal fisheries and coastal ecosystems. They do a lot of the primary research with the University of the South Pacific. They take on a lot of the analytical work, research, and training that country A, B, or C simply wouldn't have the ability to do on their own. But they also are able to weave together the synergies across the island nations. So each of these crop agencies is able to lift up the knowledge, the data, the training, the capacity building that the countries need individually, but are able to do it on a regional scale. So that helps very much, right? So for example, our programs on resilience, we work with SPC on resilience. Our programs on coastal fisheries, we work with them. There's another agency called the Foreign Fisheries Agency, and they do all of the very sophisticated surveillance for tuna, and they coordinate the world of tuna in particularly up for the parties of the Nauru Agreement. These are the sort of the very big players in the tuna world. But they also deal with the Tupelo arrangement, which is more of the South Pacific for the albacore tuna, because the albacore tuna is much more in the south. And so FFA and SPC and SPREC, they're all dealing with a myriad of challenges, but they're actually able to do it on behalf of the countries. They get their funding from Australia, from New Zealand, from others. They also are able to provide the type of technical support that allows these countries. Individual staff in the ministries, they are really bearing the weight of this, but the crop agencies help. Does that answer your question to a certain extent, Andy?
Yeah, although to follow up on what a previous question was about the politics of it, just thinking of it from a country perspective, I could see that people would feel, or government decision makers would feel pretty much out of control, not only of nature, but of resources, of financial resources that might be available to them, because they're so dependent on these other regional agencies and regional or international funding agencies. It's kind of like I could see that as a problem in terms of feeling powerless in terms of not only facing a response to nature, but in facing an ability to get resources that can handle the problems within their own jurisdiction. So I don't know if you come across that, if there's if there is kind of pushback at times from people that feel that they're not really making the decisions that are the key decisions about. You talked about the IDA funds, the areas that the different countries can choose, and that seems to be one way of trying to empower the countries to feel that they're in control. But with all these other agencies out there with their own agendas and their own decision-making capacities in terms of who's going to get the resources that they have, I wonder if you see that as a problem in dealing with some of these countries in terms of their, that sense of powerlessness and resentment about not having the ability to control what resources they're able to acquire.
Yeah, I don't know if it's I don't know if it's a sense of not being in control of what resources are available or what's coming in. I think the challenge is how do you have the capacity to implement all the different funding resources. So it's not that these entities, like the different funding sources or the different development partners are coming in and sort of running amok in a country doing programs or projects. It's just the sheer weight of so many programs at one time. And so what we try to do, if you look over in the red boxes, right, and you add Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, we have coordination groups. So we make sure that the work that we do sector by sector is actually very well coordinated. So for example, in the fisheries world, which is a big part of my portfolio right now, I have counterparts in DFAT and MFAT, so Australia and New Zealand aid. I talk to them every week, right? And every program that I do, we synchronize our work together. So for example, I'm designing a program now in Kiribati, right, which is where I was last week. And I meet with the New Zealand High Commissioner. We actually designed the programs together, right? And to make sure that the three people that we're talking to have a very cohesive program, and that we're not putting so many demands from two different entities. We're actually designing programs in synchronicity. So a big part of our job is to make sure that we work hand in hand with our development partners to lessen the degree to which the ministries have to deal with many different partners. So it's a process, right? Each institution comes with different incentive structures and ways of being and needs. But I see in the Pacific really excellent coordination in trying to lessen the impact of so many entities and funding resources coming in.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cadman. We're at time,
Aw.
so we're going to be respectful of everyone's time, and yours especially now that it's 7:30 in the morning. Thank you.
I know, I have to work early today. I've got so much time before anyone shows up.
Well, thank you so much. We really
Thank you.
appreciate you being part of this and the good work you do in the world. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Such a pleasure. I hope it was enjoyable for all of you.
Absolutely.